friends' speeches, but that's okay because they did not cover everything. And I will not cover everything by any stretch of the imagination either. There was so much that could be said. Lee Strobel was a newscaster and interviewer that has made some documentaries that have been on the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, and some other famous channels. He's made several in which he, I believe he's Baptist. But what he's done is he's made these documentaries that deal with apologetics. Two of them are titled The Case for Christ and The Case for Faith. And Lee Strobel basically starts out by saying there is logical reasoning to accept the Christian faith. Now, he is doing this in a very loosened way. He is not a member of the church. But he was doing an interview in one of these documentaries where he was just going out on the street. And he was asking people the basic question, do you believe in Jesus Christ? Or what do you think of Jesus Christ? You know, I'm always amazed whenever you look on TV and you see people like Jay Leno and others. They do these interviews and they'll ask these basic questions. Do you believe George Washington cut down the cherry tree? Or what is the Fifth Amendment? What does it actually say? It is amazing what questions they ask that should be known that the average person just does not have a clue. Well, that was certainly the case when Lee Strobel took to the streets and asked the average person out of the street. He was obviously not in the Bible Belt. He was in other parts of the nation. What do you think of Jesus Christ? Pretty much everybody in the interview, and that was his point, said, well, I don't believe he was real. I believe he was a myth. Well, this is just legends and fables. If there was a Jesus, then he certainly couldn't have done all the things that the New Testament said he did. Those were the average comments coming from most people. That idea is as old as the first century. Even when the apostles were preaching, Peter said, we did not follow myths. The word fable here actually comes from the Greek word muthos. Muthos is the word from which we derive the word myth. And it's used 5 times in the New Testament. The King James, in every case, renders it by the word fable. It's interesting to look at a study of that word myth. The ancient Greeks, and by ancient I mean before New Testament times, you know, the people of the classical Greek age, Homer, Hesiod, and others, when they talked about the word myth, myth was simply a synonym for news, just things. They didn't make a distinction between whether it was historical, whether it was true, or whether it was just make-believe. Not in the original time that the word came to be used. But, and in fact, there are some writings where it's actually synonymous with the word logos. Logos is the Greek word for word. That you have a myth, you have a word, you have news, or you have historia, history, as Eusebius would write. The ancient Greeks did not make a distinction. They thought of all these words as synonyms. But in the process of time, and especially by the time of the New Testament writers, the word myth took on a negative connotation. It began to be used more and more with the idea of what women tell little children to make them behave. Stories and legends, sagas, things that simply were meant for their educational value, but were not necessarily meant to be taken as factual. Well, by the time of the New Testament writers, they took the word myth and they never used it in a positive connotation. It was always used in a negative way. Old wives' tales and fables, endless fables and genealogies. And you have here, we did not follow cunningly devised fables. The word cunningly devised is one word in the original, and it literally is a word that also carries within it the word wisdom, Sophia. Sesophramenos is the participle. And it means we did not take wise craftiness to construct these things. You know, it does take some ingenuity to make up a story that has any kind of sense of reasonability. The case was told of some mischievous boys that were late for school because they were out doing mischievous things. And when they came in late, the teacher said, "Why are you late?" And they said, "Well, we had a flat tire on the way to school." And she said, not being misgiven or undone, "Okay, each of you boys get into a corner of the room." So the 4 boys stepped into each one, their separate corner, and she went to them individually and she said, "Which tire?" Well, You got to be careful sometimes. Ingenuity is necessary when you make up a story. And if you make up a story that has to have perfect harmony within itself, it does take some doing. You ever known someone that lies so much they forget the truth? They can't tell when they're lying and when they're telling the truth. Peter said, we were not just a bunch of men that concocted these fanciful ideas. Then he gives the contrast. But we were eyewitnesses. What is an eyewitness? An eyewitness actually has some value. You might have people who have researched a thing. I believe Luke would fall into that category when he said he did some extensive research in his gospel and in the book of Acts. He was actually a witness to the events of Acts, but not to the events of the gospel of Luke. But he thoroughly researched his material. But there's nothing that can replace the value of being an eyewitness. See, being an eyewitness, one thing that it does for you is an eyewitness does not have to worry about whether or not he is going to disagree with what somebody else might say. He's not interested in that. He just gives you what he saw. Now these fellows, the apostles, they tell their stories. People will say, well, you know, the Gospels, they will contradict because one will give more detail than another one does, or one gives some idea and the other one doesn't cover that in the same story. One gives the name to a fella and another one talks about two fellas. Whatever. These guys were eyewitnesses. They were not interested in whether or not they were trying to agree with each other. And so an eyewitness takes away the concern or the potential for collusion. An eyewitness is only telling you what he saw. An eyewitness also carries with him a certain weight of authenticity, of veracity, if you would. If you were to talk to someone who saw an event and said, look, I was there. I saw it. You don't have much you can say about that, do you? There's not much you can argue against the fact when a fellow tells you, I saw it. I know what I'm talking about. So there was a value in being an eyewitness, and this was Peter's argument. We did not just concoct fanciful stories. We were not just Jewish scholars who made up these things, but we were eyewitnesses. We know what we're talking about. And then he says this, when we made known unto you his majesty, verse 16, the last part. Eyewitnesses of his majesty, rather. The word majesty is an interesting word. Megaleotes. It's an adjective that carries with it the idea of God and his uniqueness. You know what sunshine is. You know what starlight is. You know what moonlight is. We might could coin some words. You have sunshine, you have moonshine, even though that's a different connotation. Sunshine, moonshine, and Godshine. If I could just coin those words. The idea here of this word was literally the essence of God. The divine shine, if you would. God shine. So when he says majesty, he doesn't just simply mean the royalty of presence. He means the uniqueness of that which comes from God. He uses another word, very similar, in the next verse. He uses the word megapepes, compound of two words, one of which we get our word preppy, or prep school. The idea is befitting or proper, appropriate. And he uses that when he says, he received from God the Father honor and glory when there came such a voice to him from the excellent glory. And that word, different word, but the same idea, is you have Jesus' own Godshine, that is his own divine essence, his majesty, that came to him from the excellent glory, from the very character of the one who is God. Very interesting words that he chose to use there. And then he mentions in verse 16, the power and coming of our Lord. You see, that was a major theme in the book of 2 Peter. The power and the coming. Not just the coming of Christ, but the power and coming. Now the question is, to what coming is Peter referring to in this verse? Is he referring to his first advent, when he was walking the earth and talked with the disciples and was crucified and was buried and raised again? Or is he talking about that promised second coming? Well, the tenor of the entire book is about the second coming. The word coming that's used here in Greek is the word parousia. And literally it means his appearance. His power and his appearing, his coming. I take it that this is referring to his second coming. Peter and the apostles declared, he's coming again. He's coming again in power.